Alright, so we're going to start our third section now on the endocrine system with the anterior pituitary. Quick description beyond what we've talked about so far with the structure of this gland, as well as a relatively brief description of what each one of the hormones do. So the anterior pituitary, again, like I mentioned before, I think in the second section, is not actually technically part of the nervous system, even though it's attached to it. Even though it's controlled indirectly by the nervous system, it's not developmentally or anatomically technically part of the nervous system. It is a glandular structure. It produces its own hormones. It doesn't release any hormones produced by the hypothalamus, which is what the posterior pituitary is going to do. It actually makes its own hormones and releases those hormones sort of at will when the hypothalamus tells it to. And again, we talked about the releasing versus inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus delivered to the anterior via the blood, but again, those hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary itself. So the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are what we call tropic hormones. They are, in a way, almost like bossy, I guess, kind of hormones. I always think about the anterior pituitary as being sort of bossy to other glands because it tells other glands what to do. The hormones produced by the anterior pituitary tell other endocrine glands to go ahead and release their own respective substances. So we're going to take a look at three main categories here of tropic hormones produced and released by the anterior pituitary. All right, so the first group of hormones produced and released by the anterior pituitary is the peptide hormones. And these start off as a protein. They get modified based on the original structure of the protein into a functional hormone, usually around 40 or so amino acids in size or less. The first one that's going to be produced here is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which is mercifully less I guess difficult to say. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is a hormone that causes the cortex of the kidneys to go ahead and release their own hormones, which we'll see in a few minutes. But this is a releasing hormone produced and released by the anterior adenohypophysis that tells the cortex of the kidney to release its own hormones. The second peptide hormone is melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, and so this hormone is one that's going to be released when someone is exposed to extensive amounts of sunlight or radiation of some kind. This causes or would encourage melanocytes in the skin, which we've talked about before. Melanocytes are the cells that can produce melanin, which is a pigment, which causes your skin to darken. MSH is released in response to solar radiation. It encourages melanocytes in the skin to produce melanin and darken, which is just a really fancy way of saying this is one of the things which encourages or begins the tanning process. Second category of anterior pituitary hormones are the protein hormones, and these are a bit bigger. These are around 200 or so amino acids in size. So growth hormone would be one. If you hear discussion of HGH or human growth hormone, this would be the naturally produced version of that. It's produced by the anterior pituitary. It has a huge range of effects on the body, everything from metabolism to muscle mass to bone growth and development. Huge range of effects result from growth hormone. Prolactin is another one. So prolactin is produced by the anterior pituitary, and what this does is it acts on the mammary glands and encourages them or tells them to start producing milk around the time of childbirth and after. Third category of anterior pituitary hormones are the glycoproteins, and so again, these are even bigger. There's two main chains here. There's an alpha chain and a beta chain. Each one of those is around 100 or so amino acids, so it's the biggest of all the anterior pituitary groups. TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, so it kind of makes sense. It's going to cause the thyroid gland to go ahead and produce and release some of its own hormones, like thyroxine, for example, that we'll see here in a little bit. Both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are hormones that are involved in reproductive maturity and development and reproduction itself. These are two hormones that are produced in both males and females, because obviously both males and females have an anterior pituitary gland, but they act in different cells, right? So we talked about target cells and the receptors they contain, those sorts of things. There are different target cells in males and females for luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So we'll take a look a little bit later on when we talk about human reproduction, the effects of each of these two hormones on male and female bodies respectively, but they are both substantial. Okay, so these are what we call gonadotropins because they both have an effect on target cells in the gonads, that being the ovaries and testes, and males and females respectively. So they're going to cause development of follicles, development of or progression of eventually secondary oocyte formation in females, as well as sperm formation in males, as we'll see later on in a different chapter. All right, so in this case, we talked about this before in the previous section. There's a good example of feedback inhibition. We talked about negative feedback in our previous chapter on sort of overall animal body tissues and homeostasis. We talked about feedback inhibition back in chapter 4 when we talked about enzymes. All of these hormones are going to be under negative feedback. So when they are produced to some level where they achieve the desired effect, the end result is that there's going to be a decrease in production of these hormones and release of these hormones once the desired effect has been achieved. So, for example, once metabolism is kind of running at the right level, there's less need for thyroxine from the thyroid gland, so therefore there's going to be less need for TSH from the anterior pituitary, and we're going to reduce production of both of those two hormones once metabolism is kind of at the right level. So the overall effect here is that we want to maintain homeostasis, as we've seen before. Target cells, once the desired effect has been achieved, there's no longer a need for the specific hormone, and hormone production can be decreased. Positive feedback, again, not very common. Oxytocin is probably the best example of that one that we'll see. But positive feedback is relatively uncommon because it tends to be more of a destabilizing factor than it does a stabilizing factor. It produces movement away from homeostasis in the case of positive feedback. Ovulation actually is positive feedback as well. The results leading up to ovulation are sort of like a snowball effect where you get greater and greater and greater effect, and then eventually the overall process is done. And that's going to involve some of the other hormones like estrogen and progesterone leading up to ovulation. So these are some of the sort of the pathway, the negative feedback pathway from releasing hormones in the hypothalamus. GnRH, for example, is one that when it's produced is going to lead to a production of both FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, which would then target the gonads in both males and females. And once the gonads have released their own respective hormones, testosterone or estrogen, those hormones are now going to hit their target cells. Once that effect has been achieved, then we're going to feed back and slow down production of GnRH and slow down production of FSH and LH. So it's a stabilizing factor. We don't want to overproduce testosterone or estrogen, those sorts of things. Once we have enough, then we want to go ahead and go back to the beginning here and shut down the beginning steps that led to the production of those hormones in the first place. So that, in the end, is going to allow us to maintain a stable level of hormones in the body. The anterior pituitary, again, has historically been called a master gland because of the range of effects it has on the body. If somebody has their adenohypophysis removed, for example, it can lead to a huge range of effects, everything from reduction of glucocorticoids to thyroid-stimulating hormone to reproductive hormones to melanocyte-stimulating hormone. All the ones we talked about obviously wouldn't be produced anymore, and so there are the huge range of effects on the body if that were to occur. There are direct effects, right? So we can have direct effects like growth hormone, prolactin, MSH. All of those things pretty much have effects as soon as they're released. So prolactin, for example, leads to lactation almost immediately. MSH almost immediately leads to production of melanin by melanocytes. Other things are more indirect. So the ACTH, the TSH, and the LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone as well, all of those hormones don't actually result in something happening directly. Rather, they're going to result in some other gland becoming activated and then having some other hormone release. So they're more of an indirect effect. You could sort of look at this as the number of layers of response from the hormone. Up here, there's one layer of response. The hormone's released, it hits the target cell, and lactation occurs. Or it hits the target cell, and melanin's produced. Or it hits the target cell, bones and muscles are going to grow. Right? So that's direct effect. Indirect, you've got two levels of control. So you release the TSH. That's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland then is going to release thyroxine. Two layers of control, and then you've got regulation of metabolism happening with thyroxine. So it's a bit more indirect in the range of effects and when they occur. Growth hormone is one, again, we'll talk about this one a little bit more because it's such a wide-reaching effect on the body. A lot of the proteins that are produced that lead up to connective tissue and muscle production. A lot of that, obviously, like we've seen before, is based on protein production. We've talked about insulin-like growth factors previously in this chapter, which lead to elongation of bones, what we call endochondral bones, like the long bones in the body, right? So your femur and your humerus and the bigger, longer bones in your body involve growth plates. That's going to be stimulated by the production of insulin-like growth factors, which is a response from growth hormone. If somebody overproduces or underproduces this hormone, then they're going to be either very large in stature or very small in stature. And historically, the case was that if somebody was found to be as a child very, very small for their age as a result of what's termed pituitary dwarfism, they would be supplemented with HGH from a source. And the source in that case would have been from a cadaver, right? They would actually go into the anterior pituitary of somebody who had passed away. They would extract HGH, and they would then administer that in a therapeutic dose to a child who was maybe overly small of stature. Obviously very expensive, sort of a limited amount of extraction from any given donor, if you will. So it was relatively inefficient. What they do now is that if someone is found to be lacking in HGH, is they're actually going to synthesize it in a laboratory setting using bacteria or something similar to use human genes to make human growth hormone, which can then be administered much more efficiently, right? So it's still human growth factor, growth hormone, but you can get a lot more of it a lot more quickly. So it's a lot less expensive than it was previously when you'd have to get from a cadaver. But everything with metabolism, right? So to build protein, to build connective tissues, to grow bones, all of those things require energy usage. All of those things require metabolism. So growth hormone also has a very wide-ranging effect on those processes as well, right? So a couple of pictures here showing two extreme ends of a continuum. Picture on the left, this gentleman here is a fully mature individual. They are grown up, very small in stature, almost childlike features, but this is a case of what you would call pituitary dwarfism, as opposed to the situation over here with this gentleman who's well above average in height, exaggerated features, I guess you could say, very, very large individual. Very difficult to live at such a large height as well. Dad here is a roughly average height human being, but in this picture looks to be very, very small. When someone is of that size, it becomes very difficult for the body to withstand the pressures of such exaggerated stature. The heart in particular is under a lot of stress. The bones are under a lot of stress. Stress fractures become common. Because the human body is not really meant, I guess you could say, to be at such a large mass and large size. Look at basketball players that are really large, 7 feet and above. Back injuries, foot injuries, extremely common because of the stresses presented by having such a large frame. Now, the posterior pituitary, again, is a very, very different story. The posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus. It is therefore part of the nervous system. In fact, the name neurohypophysis kind of gives you a hint that it's part of the nervous system. It sounds like neuron, right? So it's an extension of fibers from the posterior pituitary, outgrowth of the brain, which can release hormones produced by the hypothalamus. Cell bodies in the hypothalamus produce hormones that are eventually then going to be released by the posterior pituitary. So it's a very different situation now. The posterior is not manufacturing its own hormones, whereas the anterior certainly does. And so this is part of what we call the neuroendocrine reflex. We have a nervous system and an endocrine system sort of response all rolled into one. We've got the nervous system making the hormones, deciding when they need to be released, and then the endocrine system actually does the releasing of the hormones from the posterior pituitary. So we've looked at antidiuretic hormone before. We've seen this one in the effects largely as it comes to pertaining to conserving water, preventing dehydration, minimizing dehydration. We've talked about some of the factors here, producing a more concentrated urine, maintaining blood volume, vasoconstriction, those sorts of things. Actually, vasodilation in that case if blood pressure is too high. So ways to mediate dehydration in that case. In this case, if someone is dehydrated, obviously urination is going to be less frequent because the more you urinate, the more water you lose. And if you're already dehydrated, the last thing you want to do is to get rid of extra water because you probably don't have extra water to play with. You're going to produce a more concentrated urine. Urine's going to get darker, more solutes per unit of volume because the body is trying to save as much water as it possibly can. Oxytocin we've seen before as it pertains to labor and delivery, but oxytocin is also involved in reproductive behaviors, pair bonding, those sorts of things. It's been found in a lot of animals that mate, if not for life, then close to life, more or less monogamous species, aside from humans, that when individuals with their mate, oxytocin levels tend to be high. And so that's kind of led to a lot of people sort of almost extrapolating in a way and saying that oxytocin is kind of the stuff that love is made out of. it's the feeling that you get when you're first with somebody and you can't stand to be apart from them. You got to see them every minute of every day, and you think about them nonstop. The oxytocin is kind of driving you down that pathway of wanting to be with your partner. It's very much involved with reproductive behavior that way. Oxytocin, we didn't talk about this one before, but oxytocin is also involved with expression of milk during lactation. So we've seen prolactin. We said the effect of prolactin is to stimulate mammary glands to produce the milk, but the actual release of milk from the mammary glands comes as a result of oxytocin. Oxytocin does cause a contraction of smooth muscle. It's one of the effects that it has that we've talked about before. And so when smooth muscle is contracted around the mammary glands, that actually forces milk out. And so there's a dual effect here of both prolactin and oxytocin on the lactation process to allow it to occur successfully. The thyroid gland is a gland that's found in the front of the neck, sort of on either side of the trachea. It's a more or less bow-shaped gland on either side of the trachea here. There are a couple of thyroid hormones that we're going to talk about here. Thyroxine is one that's very much a factor as it pertains to metabolism. You may have heard of someone being described as being either a hypothyroid or hyperthyroid type situation, where the thyroid gland is either producing not enough or too much thyroxine, in which case you see perhaps very dramatic impacts on that individual's body mass and level of activity and those sorts of things. Calcitonin is another unrelated hormone involved that's produced from the thyroid gland that helps to lower blood calcium. So if you have a calcium-rich diet, again, the body doesn't like to throw stuff out. If it has excess calcium in the blood, it doesn't want to just get rid of it. So if that were the case, if blood calcium were to be high, then calcitonin would be released from the thyroid gland, which would cause calcium to be stored up in the body. And so blood calcium is decreased because it's being taken out of the blood, and it's being stored up in body tissues for later release, future release, if that might be something that's needed. Thyroxine, I mentioned previously that we're going to see a little bit on amphibians here. It's kind of a kind of strange digression, I suppose. But thyroxine is also involved with frog metabolism and frog development, which is kind of bizarre. The progression of a tadpole frog to the juvenile form to the adult form involves thyroxine production. The reabsorption of the tail is initiated by production of thyroxine from the amphibian's thyroid gland. Thyroxine is a hormone that involves iodine front and center. If you don't have enough iodine, the body has a really hard time manufacturing thyroxine, and that can be very difficult. Like we talked about before, metabolism is regulated. We see development of the nervous system, so if somebody is deficient in thyroxine as they're developing, there is, in my opinion, kind of a mean term that's applied in those situations called cretinism. Usually cretin is not something you want to call somebody to be nice to them, but it's a obstruction of that individual's development, both mentally and physically, because metabolism is so fundamental to everything that we do. Levels of activity, growth, development, physically and mentally. If it doesn't occur normally, then an individual might not be quote-unquote normal as they mature. They might be lower intelligence, they might be physically underdeveloped. On the other hand, if you oversecrete it, it can also speed up development, which is not really a good thing. You might think, oh great, faster development, that's got to be good. Not really, not so much. You really want to have the right level of thyroxine if at all possible. So again, this is a good example of negative feedback. The thyroid gland producing and releasing thyroxine is the direct result of the anterior pituitary producing TSH. So we see the cells of the hypothalamus producing TSH releasing hormone. Remember, the anterior pituitary doesn't release TSH on its own. It has to be told by the hypothalamus to go ahead and release the TSH. So the TSH is then released from the anterior pituitary as a result of the releasing that occurred earlier. TSH is released into the bloodstream. It goes to the thyroid gland. And at that time, the thyroid gland is going to secrete thyroxine. Once thyroxine levels are at the appropriate level, those levels of the thyroxine itself, the hormone itself, will actually feed back and tell the anterior pituitary to not release any more thyroxine. So it's a really good way to maintain the right level of this hormone in the blood at all times. Okay, so it's, again, a really good example of negative feedback, as we've seen before. If somebody doesn't have the right level of iodine especially, the effect it can result, and we saw that back in a picture here a second ago, I forgot to address it, is a goiter. This top picture here, this lady is in an environment where she does not get enough iodine in her diet. And so the effect of that is a debilitating condition called a goiter, where the thyroid gland becomes extremely enlarged. Essentially, what's happening here is that there's not enough iodine in the diet. The glandular cells in the thyroid gland are not able to manufacture thyroxine. The body's not happy because it's not getting the thyroxine that it needs. So the kind of logical thing then would be, okay, we don't have enough hormone. Let's make a few more hormone-producing cells. And so those cells, of course, are in the thyroid. And so the thyroid gland grows. It makes more thyroid TSH-producing cells. But does that solve the problem? Not really, because you still haven't addressed the iodine deficiency. So it's kind of a vicious cycle where there's not enough thyroxine, thyroid gland gets bigger, still not enough thyroxine, thyroid gland gets bigger, and eventually it gets to the point where it's extremely enlarged, extremely debilitating, and in some cases difficult to correct. Iodine deficiencies typically occur in developing countries, usually the ones that are landlocked, so the ones that are away from the ocean are those that typically have the highest incidence of goiter in the population. All right, so we've talked about this one already a little bit with the frogs, but the other thing, the hypothyroid versus hyperthyroidism, right? So if you're not producing the right amount of thyroxine, say you're not making enough, and if you're not making enough thyroxine, you would be in the category of what we call hypothyroid. Hypothyroid, not enough thyroxine, metabolism is going to be abnormally slow. These are people who are going to have a very, very difficult time taking weight off. In fact, they might gain weight even though they're doing everything they possibly can to lose weight, doing everything right. Exercise, diet, levels of activity are good. They still gain weight. Typically, some of the other symptoms that come along with it is that they're sort of sluggish, don't feel like they have any energy. Maybe you feel like you're cold all the time. All these things go along with not having the right level of metabolism. As opposed to the other extreme, which would be hyperthyroidism. This is where you're overproducing thyroxine, so you're more active all the time. You're burning through more calories even at rest because thyroxine levels are abnormally high. So these folks are going to be those that, you know, they could eat anything they want and they'll still be skinny. They're still going to be thin, despite the fact that maybe they don't get a lot of exercise or maybe they don't have a good diet. Their thyroid gland is actually keeping them thin by overproducing thyroxine. You might think that, oh, geez, I wish that was me. I wish I could do that, but it's usually not a real good long-term condition to have. It does take its toll on the body over time. All right, calcitonin I mentioned as well. Again, this is a peptide hormone. This is one that helps to remove calcium ions from the blood and store them up in tissues because calcium ions are extremely valuable for the body. We don't want to waste them and just throw them out, those ions. So we want to save them up, store them in the body for a rainy day when maybe we don't have enough calcium in the blood. Normally, by the time you reach adulthood, this is not as big of a deal, but when in kids, in growing individuals in particular, calcitonin levels are extremely important to make sure you have the right levels in the blood at all times. All right, so we're going to stop here, and I will make one last section for this chapter. Let's get this closed up.